Former patients have described the hospital as a place of pure hell. Seema Katecha has been hearing the distressing accounts of two people who say they were abused as children.
In a world where mental health is increasingly recognized as crucial to overall well-being, the dark history of psychiatric care remains a poignant reminder of our past missteps. This video delves into the harrowing realities of what have been deemed the 5 worst psychiatric hospitals globally. Through a lens of historical analysis and modern understanding, we explore these institutions not just as relics of a bygone era, but as symbols of the ongoing struggle in mental health care. Our journey through these corridors of despair is not just about unearthing the grim past, but also about understanding how it shapes our present and future approaches to mental health. Historical overview of psychiatric hospitals. The history of psychiatric hospitals is a complex tapestry interwoven with evolving societal attitudes towards mental illness, medical advancements, and often, unfortunately, a legacy of neglect and mistreatment. Tracing back to the medieval era, care for individuals with mental illnesses was largely non-existent. Many were left to the care of their families, or, in worse cases, abandoned to the streets. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages that the first institutions resembling psychiatric hospitals began to appear. One of the earliest known facilities dedicated to the care of those with mental illnesses was established in Valencia, Spain, in 1409. Named the Hospital de los Inocentes, it marked a transition in the societal approach towards mental health. However, the initial intentions of providing care and shelter were often overshadowed by a lack of understanding and fear of mental illness. These early institutions were more about isolating the mad from society than offering any genuine treatment or rehabilitation. The Renaissance period saw some advancements in the perception of mental illness. Physicians like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England advocated for more humane treatment of the mentally ill. Pinel famously ordered the removal of chains from patients in the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, symbolizing a shift towards more compassionate care. However, these were exceptions in an era where brutal treatments and confinement were the norms. The 19th century brought the era of the asylum, a term initially coined with the promise of refuge and treatment. In the United States and Europe, large, often imposing institutions were constructed in rural areas, designed to be self-sufficient with farms, workshops, and laundries. However, the ideal of therapeutic asylum quickly deteriorated. Overcrowding, underfunding, and a lack of effective treatments turned many of these asylums into warehouses for the mentally ill. The 20th century heralded significant changes, both in understanding mental illness and in treatment approaches. The discovery of the first psychotropic drugs in the 1950s, such as chlorpromazine, offered new therapeutic options.
They are seen to be substances that somehow work on the underlying physical basis of mental disorder.
This pharmacological revolution, along with increasing criticism of institutional care, led to the deinstitutionalization movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Psychiatric hospitals began to close en masse, with the idea that community-based care would be more humane and effective. However, deinstitutionalization had its own set of problems. Many patients were discharged into communities that were unprepared and under-resourced to support them. The closure of institutions without adequate community services led to issues like homelessness and incarceration among the mentally ill population. It highlighted the chronic issue of underfunding in mental health care and the societal stigma still attached to mental illness. In more recent times, there has been a push towards integrating mental health care into general health care, with an emphasis on human rights and patient autonomy. The mental health landscape is increasingly focusing on community-based care, early intervention, and holistic treatment approaches that consider the biological, psychological, and social factors contributing to mental illness. Despite these advancements, the legacy of psychiatric hospitals as places of mistreatment and neglect continues to influence perceptions. Horror stories from institutions like Bedlam in England, a symbol of the chaos and inhumanity that once dominated mental health care, still linger in public consciousness. This historical context is crucial in understanding the evolution of psychiatric care and the challenges that remain in treating mental illness with the dignity and respect it deserves. As we delve into specific examples of the worst psychiatric hospitals, it's important to remember that these are not just isolated incidents of a bygone era. They are reflective of broader societal attitudes towards mental illness and the ongoing journey towards more compassionate, effective, and humane treatment methods. The history of psychiatric hospitals is not merely a record of past failures, but a continuous call to action for better mental health care and societal attitudes towards mental health. La Castaneda, Mexico. La Castaneda, once a prominent psychiatric hospital in Mexico, stands as a stark reminder of the tumultuous history of psychiatric care in the 20th century. Opened in 1910 during the presidency of Porfirio Diaz, it was built to commemorate the centennial of Mexico's independence. Designed to be a modern medical facility, it was initially celebrated as a symbol of progress and humanitarian care. However, La Castaneda's legacy would soon turn darker, becoming emblematic of the systemic issues plaguing psychiatric institutions of the era. Located in Mexico City, La Castaneda was designed following the European asylum model, sprawling over a vast area and designed to be self-sufficient. It was intended to house patients with a variety of mental illnesses separated by gender, diagnosis, and social class. Despite its noble beginnings, La Castaneda quickly succumbed to the pitfalls that afflicted many psychiatric institutions of the time: overcrowding, underfunding, and a lack of effective treatments. The hospital's patient population ballooned, reaching tens of thousands, far exceeding its capacity. This overcrowding led to unsanitary conditions, a lack of individual care, and the deterioration of the facility. Patients were often categorized in a rudimentary manner, with the mentally ill being housed alongside those with neurological disorders or developmental disabilities. This haphazard categorization, combined with insufficient staffing, resulted in a chaotic and often inhumane environment. During the Mexican Revolution, La Castaneda's troubles intensified. The political and social upheaval of the time exacerbated the hospital's funding issues and organizational chaos. It began to be used as a detention center for political dissidents, blurring the lines between a medical facility and a tool of political repression. The collapse of Diaz's regime further plunged the institution into disorder, with resources becoming even scarcer. One of the most controversial aspects of La Castaneda was its use of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. While ECT can be a legitimate treatment for certain psychiatric conditions, at La Castaneda, it was often employed without proper medical oversight or patient consent. Reports suggest that many patients subjected to ECT at the hospital were not appropriate candidates for such a treatment, leading to further deterioration in their conditions. The hospital's downfall continued into the mid-20th century. Reports of abuse, neglect, and horrific living conditions began to surface, drawing public and international attention. In 1968, in the lead-up to the Mexico City Olympics, a decision was made to close La Castaneda. This move was part of a broader effort to clean up the city, but also came in response to the increasing outcry over the hospital's conditions. The closure of La Castaneda did not mark the end of its story. The process of transferring patients to other facilities was fraught with challenges. Many of the patients had no family or had been abandoned, making their relocation and continued care problematic. Furthermore, the closure of such a large institution without adequate replacement facilities in the community led to some patients ending up homeless or in the criminal justice system, a pattern seen in other countries during the deinstitutionalization movement. Today, La Castaneda serves as a powerful symbol of the complex and often troubled history of psychiatric care in Mexico and worldwide. Its story highlights the consequences of overcrowding, underfunding, and a lack of humane treatment practices in psychiatric facilities. It also reflects the broader societal challenges in dealing with mental illness, including stigma, misunderstanding, and the intersection of mental health care with political and social issues. Reflecting on La Castaneda's history provides critical lessons for contemporary mental health care. It underscores the importance of adequate funding, patient-centered care, and the need for ongoing reform and vigilance to prevent the recurrence of such inhumane conditions. La Castaneda's legacy is a reminder of the urgent need to prioritize mental health care and ensure that psychiatric facilities serve as places of healing and dignity rather than neglect and suffering. Federico Mora Hospital, Guatemala. Federico Mora Hospital in Guatemala stands as a somber emblem of the dire state of psychiatric care in certain parts of the world. Known for its brutal reputation, the hospital's history and current status offer a distressing glimpse into the systemic failings of mental health care systems in less affluent countries. Established as the sole public psychiatric facility in Guatemala, Federico Mora Hospital was tasked with a monumental challenge from its inception. It was intended to provide care for a wide range of psychiatric conditions in a nation where mental health has long been stigmatized and underfunded. However, the hospital quickly became infamous, not for the care it provided, but for the appalling conditions and human rights abuses that occurred within its walls. The hospital's descent into notoriety can be attributed to several key factors. Foremost among these is chronic underfunding. Like many public health institutions in developing countries, Federico Mora Hospital has struggled with insufficient resources. This scarcity has led to overcrowding, understaffing, and a severe lack of basic supplies and medications. In such an environment, providing adequate care becomes nearly impossible, and patients' basic needs are often unmet. Another significant issue is the lack of trained mental health professionals and adequate training for the existing staff. This shortage means that patients often do not receive appropriate or compassionate care. In many cases, staff members are not equipped to handle the complex needs of psychiatric patients, leading to neglect and abuse. Reports of physical and sexual abuse within the hospital have surfaced over the years.
She said on her very first day, she was sexually abused upon admission,
Painting a harrowing picture of a system that has failed its most vulnerable. Furthermore, the hospital's location in one of Guatemala City's most dangerous areas adds another layer of complexity. Surrounded by violence and gang activity, the facility itself becomes a place of peril rather than sanctuary. This external threat exacerbates the internal issues, creating an atmosphere of fear and instability. The hospital's practices have also come under scrutiny. Human rights organizations have reported the use of seclusion and physical restraints as common practices within the hospital. Such methods are not only inhumane, but also counterproductive to the treatment and rehabilitation of psychiatric patients. These practices reflect a broader issue of outdated and harmful treatment methods still being used in many psychiatric facilities worldwide. Federico Mora Hospital's challenges are symptomatic of a larger, systemic problem in global mental health care. In countries where mental health is not a priority, psychiatric facilities often become dumping grounds for not only the mentally ill but also for the elderly, the homeless, and even political dissidents. The hospital becomes a microcosm of societal neglect and stigma surrounding mental illness. Despite the grim picture, there have been efforts to improve conditions at Federico Mora Hospital. International organizations and local activists have called for reforms, including better funding, staff training, and the implementation of humane treatment practices. However, progress has been slow, and the hospital continues to struggle with its dark legacy.
La presencia de la Defensoría de la Salud consiste en que en este hospital se ha presentado un problema con la falta de agua.
The story of Federico Mora Hospital is a stark reminder of the urgent need for global mental health reform. It highlights the importance of adequate funding, proper training for mental health professionals, and the need for a paradigm shift in how society views and treats mental illness. The hospital's history serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when psychiatric care is neglected and stigmatized. Federico Mora Hospital's reputation as one of the world's most brutal psychiatric centers is a call to action. It underscores the need for a concerted global effort to address the disparities in mental health care and to ensure that all individuals, regardless of their location or economic status, have access to compassionate and effective mental health services. The hospital's story is not just a reflection of the state of psychiatric care in Guatemala, but a mirror showing the world the consequences of neglecting mental health. Ashton Hall, England. Ashton Hall in Derbyshire, England, embodies a chilling chapter in the history of psychiatric care. Established in the 1930s, its initial conception was to serve as a blend of a reformatory and a health institution. However, the reality of Ashton Hall was far grimmer, with its legacy marred by allegations of abuse and maltreatment that have since become emblematic of the systemic failures in psychiatric institutions of the past. Initially, Ashton Hall was intended to cater to children and young adults labeled as special, a term ambiguously applied to those with a range of behavioral and psychological issues. Many of these young individuals were not suffering from severe mental illnesses, but were rather struggling with behavioral or conduct problems. Rather than receiving the care and guidance they needed, they found themselves in an institution where the line between treatment and punishment was disturbingly blurred.
And I'm going to what I believe to be a hospital. It turns out to be basically a children's prison.
The first signs of trouble at Ashton Hall emerged with testimonies from former patients who began speaking out in the 1990s. Their accounts painted a harrowing picture of life inside the institution. Reports of physical and emotional abuse, excessive and inappropriate use of medication and neglect were rampant. These allegations were shocking to the public, but they also shed light on the broader issue of how society treated its most vulnerable members. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ashton Hall was the alleged use of a controversial treatment involving a so-called truth serum. During the 1950s and 1960s, it was reported that the hospital extensively used sodium amytal, a barbiturate known for its truth-inducing properties.
65 children were allegedly given the experimental truth drug sodium amytal.
The drug was purportedly used to induce a state of reduced consciousness in patients, during which they were more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. This practice, intended for therapeutic purposes, was allegedly abused to exploit and control patients. This form of treatment was not only ethically questionable, but also medically dubious. The use of sodium amytal in such a manner had the potential to cause significant harm to patients, both physically and psychologically. The allegations suggest that patients at Ashton Hall were not only deprived of proper care, but were subjected to experimental and potentially harmful treatments without their consent. The outcry against Ashton Hall eventually led to its closure, but the institution's legacy remains a point of contention. Investigations into the allegations of abuse and mistreatment were inconclusive, partly due to the lack of records and the passage of time. However, the testimonies of former patients continue to resonate, serving as a powerful reminder of the institution's troubled history.
Would you have been in a position, or any of your colleagues have been in a position to say, "Doctor, stop this"?
No.
Ashton Hall's story is reflective of a larger trend in psychiatric care during the mid-20th century. It was a time when mental health treatments were still in a nascent stage, often characterized by experimental approaches and a lack of oversight. The plight of Ashton Hall's patients underscores the vulnerability of psychiatric patients, particularly children, and the importance of safeguarding their rights and well-being. The legacy of Ashton Hall also highlights the need for continual vigilance and reform in psychiatric care. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority in mental health institutions and the potential for abuse in environments where patients are dehumanized and treated as subjects rather than individuals deserving of care and respect. The history of Ashton Hall is not just a narrative of past abuses, but a reminder of the ongoing challenges in providing ethical and compassionate mental health care. It emphasizes the importance of transparency, accountability, and patient-centered approaches in psychiatric treatment. The lessons learned from Ashton Hall's dark past continue to inform and shape modern psychiatric practices, serving as a stark reminder of the critical need for humanity and empathy in the treatment of mental illness. Wickermund, Germany. Wickermund, a psychiatric hospital in Germany, has a history that is deeply intertwined with the darkest chapters of the 20th century, particularly the Nazi regime. The hospital's legacy, fraught with controversy and tragedy, serves as a poignant reminder of the profound impact that political and social contexts can have on medical institutions, especially those caring for the most vulnerable. During the Nazi era, Wickermund became an integral part of a horrifying agenda. The regime, obsessed with racial purity and the elimination of what they termed life unworthy of life, turned many psychiatric hospitals into centers of unspeakable atrocities. Wickermund was no exception. It became a site where patients, deemed unworthy by the distorted eugenic policies of the Nazis, faced unimaginable fates. The hospital played a role in the T4 program, a secret Nazi operation aimed at the systematic killing of individuals with disabilities and mental illnesses, under the guise of mercy deaths or euthanasia. Patients at Wickermund were subjected to forced sterilizations and often murder, The program was a chilling implementation of the regime's eugenic policies, and Wickermund was complicit in these acts of state-sponsored violence. The impact of these atrocities on the victims and their families was catastrophic, leaving a scar on the collective memory of the community. The dehumanization and brutality that took place within the walls of Wickermund were emblematic of the broader crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Nazi regime. Following the end of World War II and the fall of the Nazis, Wickermund, like many institutions implicated in these crimes, faced a period of reckoning. The process of denazification aimed to cleanse German institutions, including psychiatric hospitals, of Nazi influence and ideology. However, this process was often complicated and imperfect. Many of the staff who had worked at Wickermund during the Nazi era remained in their positions, and the legacy of the hospital's involvement in the T4 program was a difficult stain to remove. The post-war period was a time of reflection and reformation for psychiatric care in Germany. The atrocities committed at Wickermund and similar institutions led to a profound re-evaluation of psychiatric practices and the ethics of care for vulnerable populations. It also highlighted the necessity of protecting human rights within medical settings, particularly for those unable to advocate for themselves. Despite these reforms, the shadow of the past lingered at Wickermund. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted on its victims during the Nazi era could not be easily erased. Survivors and their families continued to grapple with the aftermath of the hospital's dark history, and the broader societal implications of how the mentally ill and disabled were treated under the Nazi regime remained a subject of deep introspection and debate. In more recent times, Wickermund has come to symbolize both the capacity for harm and the potential for healing within psychiatric care. Efforts have been made to confront and learn from the hospital's past, transforming it into a place where ethical and compassionate care is prioritized. The history of Wickermund serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance against the misuse of medical authority and the need for empathy and respect in the treatment of all patients. The legacy of Wickermund is complex and multifaceted. It is a story of how a medical institution can be co-opted for nefarious purposes, but it is also a story of resilience and reform. The hospital's transformation in the post-war era reflects a broader societal shift towards a more humane and ethical approach to psychiatric care. It underscores the ongoing need to ensure that the rights and dignity of psychiatric patients are safeguarded and that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. Wickermund's history during and after the Nazi regime is a stark reminder of the intersection between politics, social ideologies, and medical practice. It highlights the critical importance of ethical standards in healthcare and serves as a cautionary tale about the potential consequences when these standards are disregarded. As a symbol of both tragedy and hope, Wickermund continues to play a role in the collective memory of Germany and the global conversation on mental health care. The legacy of psychiatric hospitals. Conclusions and reflections. The legacy of psychiatric hospitals is a complex and multifaceted narrative that intertwines the evolution of mental health care with the broader societal understanding and treatment of mental illness. The histories of La Castañeda, Federico Mora Hospital, Ashton Hall, and Wickermund reveal not only the depths of human suffering and neglect, but also the potential for reform, understanding, and compassion. These institutions, in their different contexts and times, mirror the challenges and changes in mental health treatment, reflecting societal attitudes towards those with mental illnesses. Historically, psychiatric hospitals were often places of last resort, where the misunderstood and the marginalized were hidden away from society. The deplorable conditions, lack of effective treatments, and often inhumane attitudes towards patients in these hospitals were symptomatic of a broader societal stigma and misunderstanding of mental illness. However, these institutions also became sites of medical advancements and reforms, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, as understanding of mental health evolved and treatment approaches shifted. The closure of many such institutions, particularly during the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 1970s, marked a significant shift in mental health care. The movement, driven by the recognition of the rights and dignity of mental health patients, sought to integrate them into the community and provide more humane and effective treatment. However, this transition was not without its challenges. The lack of adequate community-based services, coupled with ongoing stigma and underfunding, led to new problems, such as increased homelessness and incarceration among the mentally ill. Today, the legacy of these psychiatric hospitals continues to inform contemporary mental health care practices. There is a greater emphasis on patient rights, ethical treatment, and a holistic approach that considers the biological, psychological, and social factors contributing to mental illness. Advances in psychopharmacology, psychotherapy, and community-based care have transformed the treatment landscape, offering hope and improved quality of life for many. Yet the challenges in mental health care remain significant. Stigma and misunderstanding about mental illness persist, impacting both the availability of resources and the willingness of individuals to seek help. The global disparity in mental health services is stark, with low and middle-income countries often lacking the resources and infrastructure to provide adequate care. Furthermore, the mental health impacts of contemporary issues, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, economic instability, and social inequalities, have highlighted the urgent need for robust and accessible mental health systems. The histories of psychiatric hospitals like La Castañeda, Federico Mora, Ashton Hall, and Wickermund serve as potent reminders of the consequences of neglect, stigma, and inadequate care. They also demonstrate the capacity for change and improvement in the face of adversity. The transformation in mental health care from confinement and neglect to a more compassionate and holistic approach is a testament to the progress that has been made. However, it is also a call to action to continue this progress, address the ongoing challenges, and ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated.